New Scotland Yard, synonymous with excellence in crime solving, recognised as a world leader in murder investigation. Every year, New Scotland Yard's experienced detectives unravel the twisted truth from the tragedies that unfold across the bustling capital city of London. Uncovering evidence that nails the guilty beyond all reasonable doubt takes time, dedication, and a forensic attention to detail. This is New Scotland Yard Files. Tonight, a vulnerable young man, a pop star who fell into mental illness.
They must have known he was vulnerable. He was frightened and he was lost.
Fatally burnt in the dead of night on a roadside in North London.
There was no happy ending to this.
Absolutely awful. And what happened afterwards has been awful for the family too.
And a family determined to find out why.
It can't be that family like mine are left to battle against insuperable odds.
It is 1:40 a.m, the 28th of January, 1997. An off-duty fireman is driving home along the North Circular Road near Edmonton, North London.
He sees a man on fire at the side of the road and does what any fire officer would do.
He pulls over, bats out the flames, and puts an urgent call into the emergency services. In all his years in the fire service, he's never seen anything like this. How did something so awful happen to this young man? Was this an accident? Or could he have done this terrible thing to himself? Documents on the burning man's body reveal that his name is Michael Menson. It will take the combination of a specialised task force and a 3-year investigation to reveal exactly what happened. Michael Menson is clinging to life when emergency services arrive at the scene. They notice something odd about his behaviour.
He was reported as having spoken to the first 2 police officers that got to him. For some reason, those officers reported that he was mumbling and incoherent.
They were treating the burns of Michael Menson. They observed that he wasn't reacting to the injuries.
New Scotland Yard detective Niall Dehaan worked on the task force that ultimately solved the case in the late 1990s.
The word catatonic, I believe, was passed from the ambulance crew to the police.
The officers at the scene did not think it was suspicious, and it's probably right to say that there was no reason for them to think that.
Kevin Davis, now retired, led the New Scotland Yard task force that picked up the case after the original investigation.
It was recorded as an illness street by the night duty CRD officers, and that was their thought processes at the time.
Illness in the street is police code for an incident involving a person suffering anything from an injury to a severe mental illness.
It was an unusual situation to come across, and everybody found themselves in a situation where they weren't getting much information at the time.
Michael Menson, who seems to be in a catatonic state, is transferred to a specialist burns unit. Full-depth, third-degree burns on 30% of his body had destroyed the skin on his back and buttocks. 16 days later, Michael Menson dies. But how did this tragedy happen? As the horror of the incident hits the headlines, it seems a far cry from a capital city where life seems to be getting better every year. London in 1997 is a capital on the rise. A decade of growth in the banking industry has seen the city become a global financial centre. And culturally, London is a byword for cool, harking back to its swinging 60s heyday.
London had progressed massively. I mean, since the 70s, when it was a grey, dirty, dull place, it had blossomed like mad, and there was a lot of money in London.
A series of classic, crime-ridden 1970s estates have been pulled down and replaced with innovative flats and houses.
Flourishing entertainment industry, film industry, flourishing restaurants, all that kind of thing. People went to the cinema, people went to the theatre. So it was a very high-rolling kind of place.
But behind the facade of new skyscrapers, pop stars and supermodels lurks a harsher reality.
So as London came up, and areas which had been no-go areas were now very chic, what that meant was that some areas were coming up very fast and were right close to areas that definitely weren't. It was easy to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
In the late 90s, cases of young black men encountering racial violence were on the rise in the London region.
This is the bus stop where Stephen Lawrence was brutally stabbed to death in a savage racial attack.
The murder of Stephen Lawrence had become highly controversial over the years. The Metropolitan Police Service were being criticised for not taking racist crime against the black community seriously enough.
Stephen's murder provoked angry protests, and the inquiry will address not just the police and Crown prosecution's actions, but the wider issue of racially motivated violence.
There'd been no trials, there'd been no arrests. And so you had this slow progress of black communities getting more and more angry and thinking they were being treated as second-class citizens.
Was Michael Menson the victim of a brutal racial attack? The police investigating the strange incident of the Burning Man don't think so. They think he set himself on fire. The police think Michael Menson's mental health played a part in the tragedy. He was carrying documents that showed he was being treated for schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, of course, is a severe form of psychosis. In Michael's case, he had catatonic schizophrenia. As well as all of the typical symptoms of schizophrenia, on top of that, he would also suffer from zoning out, from periods where he becomes dissociated, almost sleepy, almost in a sort of type of seizure. These can last from seconds to minutes. And the worst thing, I think, for those who suffer from catatonic schizophrenia is the reaction of other people.
Michael Menson hadn't always suffered from mental illness. The son of a Ghanaian diplomat, he is part of a large family. He has close ties to his well-educated and successful siblings. In his 20s, he had been a professional musician, hitting the top 10 with his band, Double Trouble.
Michael Menson was a very, very talented musician. He was part of Double Trouble, and they had 2 #1 hits in the UK.
But in the early 90s, his band broke up.
Then something went wrong. Mental health problems started to dominate his life. He got diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was in a residential home looking after himself and receiving medication from a hospital in North London, and had completely left the music scene.
The police focus on Michael's catatonic schizophrenia. It could explain his incoherence on the night of the incident, and it underpins their assumption that this is a suicide.
The officers concluded this was mental health and that he had set himself on fire.
Even though Michael Menson is found on the grassy verge of the North Circular Road in Edmonton, there's evidence that the fire began nearby on Silver Street, by these phone boxes.
He leaned back into the telephone box to try and put it out. It didn't work.
The fire had been so hot it had partially melted the Perspex doors.
Then he ran quite some distance down Silver Street, up the North Circular Road, where he would have been seen by the off-duty fireman, and the story went from there.
Before Kevin Davis and Niall DeHaan get involved, the original investigation is carried out by Edmonton police.
The family at that stage, they were presumably being led by the police in trying to figure out what had happened.
But in the days after the incident, the Menson family begin to have serious doubts about the direction of the police investigation.
It's quite clear the police did do things. They weren't sitting on their hands doing nothing. They weren't getting anywhere, and they were stuck in this idea that, in the end, Michael did it to himself.
Michael's family suspects that the police are not being open-minded to other possibilities beyond suicide.
The reality is that Michael was a black man who'd had bouts of mental illness, and I think these two factors, certainly, I personally believe they've influenced the way the investigation, when it finally started, has been carried out.
The family have a growing feeling that there's more to the case.
I think Michael's family, being a very professional, well-qualified, very erudite family, were very frustrated with the police. Well, it was just such a weird thing. A young man trying to kill himself by setting fire to himself, which would have been really difficult to do. It just didn't really quite make sense. It puzzled all of us in the newsroom. We weren't convinced. And we didn't come across people setting fire to themselves other than as a large political gesture, usually out in the open with a very big can of petrol. And this wasn't like that at all.
Michael Menson was an outpatient at the Chase Farm Hospital in North London. Here he received treatment for his condition, catatonic schizophrenia. Having been ill for most of the past decade, he had few friends, no known enemies, and kept himself to himself.
You have Michael Menson, who's in recovery from his illness. He's in his halfway home. He got approached by his nurse that worked in the place that night and said, "Oh, Michael, you need to be at the hospital. You need your injection." All of a sudden, he found he had to get himself to the hospital. There's a W6 bus goes from there, and there's a W9 bus goes from there. One goes to the hospital, one goes to Edmonton. He got the wrong one. He realised that the familiarity of his route to the hospital was out of sync, and then he got out in Silver Street.
What happened next is a key question for Michael Menson's family. As soon as Michael was discovered burning on the roadside, the police assumed he'd set himself on fire. But for the family, new evidence had emerged that threw the official line into doubt.
Michael survived for quite a while, and he was able to talk to his family.
At 11 a.m. on the 28th of January, barely 10 hours after the incident, Kwesi and Essie Menson were at their brother's bedside. What they heard was to radically change the whole thrust of the investigation.
Michael's brother had gone to the Billericay Burns unit the following morning and had sat by his bedside and talked to him. And at that stage, Michael was obviously conscious. And from Kwesi's notes, seemed to be thinking quite clearly about and remembering quite clearly about what happened to him. After Kwesi had sat by Michael's bedside, on the day after he'd been found, Kwesi had written in his notes that Michael had said, "There were some white boys who set me alight."
How did this happen? Some boys put me on fire. Where? Edmonton, by a phone box. Were they black or white? White.
To the Menson family's surprise, they discover that the police have little interest in Michael's statement.
Police never talked to Michael during the fortnight after the attack and before he died. The only record of his story was his brother Kwesi's notes of conversations in hospital, which when handed to detectives was met with skepticism and explained away as the muddled thoughts of a deeply traumatized man suffering from paranoid schizophrenia.
The family begin to campaign for Michael's case to be treated as murder instead of suicide. But it won't be easy to get the police to change course.
If you went back and spoke to the officers, they hadn't really been trained in any depth in mental health. So they didn't understand about whether people were telling the truth or not, whether people with mental illness were liars or not. They were going there with bias from their own experience and their own beliefs, rather than with an open mind about what had happened.
Despite the resistance, Michael Menson's formidable family do not give up.
After Michael's unfortunate death, they kept fighting the cause. They wanted to find out why this happened and who would have done this to the brother who they loved. So he came from a loving family.
It can't be that family like mine are left to battle against insuperable odds and to continue to fight until we begin to be taken seriously.
With intervention from the new Labour government, keen to avoid a similar controversy to the Stephen Lawrence case, the Menson family achieved something extraordinary. An inquiry into the original police investigation begins in February, over a year after the incident. It will continue until September 1998.
I remember listening to one of the officers who was at the scene giving her account. Well, he was in a trance, he had mental health issues, it looked like, you know, our assumption was it self-inflicted. This was an extremely traumatic event for Michael Menson. And yet the police never seemed to take into account the impact of trauma on this poor guy. Never.
During the inquiry, the family asked a pathologist to testify on the nature of Michael's injuries. His conclusion marks a turning point.
It's unlikely that the burns were self-inflicted because of the pattern of distribution of them, which is solely down the back and not on the front of the body. If people burn themselves, then they usually burn themselves by pouring some fluid over the top of them and burning the whole of the body, and particularly the front.
The pathologist turns the whole case on its head. The jury's verdict at the inquiry: unlawful killing, not suicide.
Unlawful killing goes directly contradictory to everything the police had worked on the basis of we can't find any evidence of a suspicious killing.
Thanks to the efforts of his family, the Michael Menson case is now a murder investigation, almost 2 years after the incident.
This verdict marks the beginning, not the end, of the family's search for justice for Michael. His killers are still unknown and free. The family appeal for witnesses, for people who saw the attack or who know the killers, to come forward.
The family had a renewed sense of confidence that they were right. Here was the judicial system saying, corroborating what they'd always said had happened.
We need a new investigation to be carried out by a different police force.
Within a few months, political pressure from the new Labour government opens doors for the family.
So there is to be a new investigation, overseen by Scotland Yard's recently formed Racial Crime Unit.
We are to meet with the new task force and try and establish an appropriate investigation to be underway as soon as possible. Our primary goal of having the killers of our brother brought to justice seems finally to be underway.
A whole new team of people who from the word go say, this is murder. And the family were being asked to trust them just one more time.
We need to look into the entire police investigation to date, to find the holes that exist in it, and to ensure that these are exhaustively covered.
Kevin Davis is instructed to assemble a completely new team.
I was requested to go to Scotland Yard to meet Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Grieve at the Racial and Violent Crime Task Force. I was asked to put a team together of 12 people that had the relevant experience in investigations, in homicides, and all had the right skill set to look at the Michael Menson murder.
It needed a whole different attitude to deal with this without prejudice and not make assumptions. So gradually the light was dawning. that these cases needed to be treated very differently.
It's 2 years since Michael was killed, and we have to continue pushing for the right things to be done at the right times until we catch his killers. We can't rest.
The new team get to work.
The challenge that we faced with a new investigation was taking on an investigation which was politically charged. There was pressure which was always felt by the team to deliver and to bring the investigation to a satisfactory conclusion.
Kevin's boss, John Grieve, is known to have an innovative approach to crime fighting.
John Grieve was from the counter-terrorism and had been working on intelligence gathering methods for years in Northern Ireland. And he had decided, OK, this is what we're going to do.
John brought different techniques, things that we wouldn't normally have used, things that John was bringing from his terrorism world, some really quite intrusive surveillance, getting some evidence and actually going after these people in the way that we should have done, which is as major criminals.
We're fairly convinced that people have been threatened with fire. Has somebody set fire to you accompanied by filthy racist abuse? Somebody threatened to set fire to you on a bus? We know there are other cases that we've never got to hear about. We really need that information.
And the word racist thugs suddenly emanated as the target of this investigation, and it was a murder investigation. That was it. That was it. In clear terms, the Met had turned the corner.
For the first time, the family have unquestioning support from the investigating officers.
To launch the campaign, the police arranged for Michael's siblings to appear on Crime Watch. It's the first time a victim's family has made an appeal on the programme.
Can I give you this leaflet in case you hear of anything, big or small, about what happened to my brother in this?
Part of the investigation was a Hearts and Minds campaign, primarily to galvanise the community, to search for intelligence, to search for evidence amongst the community by highlighting the horror of the offence.
The task force begin by thoroughly analysing statements gathered by the original team.
There were approximately 200 statements that had been compiled at that stage.
Nobody properly assessed them. They hadn't gone into the system properly. Nobody had looked at it because the decision had been made in a mindset that it wasn't a murder.
They had crime analysts in their unit that could link up names and addresses and times and bits from the witness statements and interviews that either the original investigation didn't see or didn't believe or didn't fit with the theory that they were stuck to, and that was that he had set fire to himself.
When we examined the papers, the statements and also the intelligence material, it was evident there were a group of dysfunctional individuals that lived near where Michael died.
It was hard to ignore the three people who eventually became the suspects.
A trio of known young troublemakers who are notorious in the area where Michael was murdered.
There was Harry Constantinou, Mario Pereira and Ozge Shavat.
One of them, Harry Constantinou, sticks out to Niall Dehaan.
It came through to us that he had discussed going to the new construction site and dropping something the size of a railway sleeper on a passing car just for fun. It's pretty out there.
The task force now has a focus, but a person of interest is by no means a suspect. If they are going to find out who attacked Michael Menson, they will have to build a case. With an inquest confirming that Michael Menson had indeed been murdered, the team are effectively investigating a cold case. There is no forensic evidence, but throughout the months after the incident, the police have been asking questions in the community. As the task force read through the huge stack of statements, they notice one name being mentioned again and again: Harry Constantinou.
Constantinou, he liked to be known as Harry the Terminator. He walked around with the dark glasses on. He had a propensity for violence.
Harry Constantinou is not alone as a person of interest. He's part of a tight-knit group of young men, including Mario Pereira and Ozge Savat, who gather by a local petrol station. And they're known as troublemakers in the community.
We knew that these chaps liked their little racy hatchbacks, which were flash in the day. They would just pump their music, and that was almost intimidating to the normal customers. Harry was the only one that we knew in that group that had his own place. And that we quickly identified that became a meeting place for everybody. Everybody would congregate to Constantinou's place.
For the detectives, this was a golden opportunity to find out if the gang were involved in this terrible crime.
The task force are faced with a major challenge: to pick up a trail that has gone cold and dig up some solid clues. They know where the gang congregate to relax and have fun in what they think is a safe space. Now the team need to figure out how to listen in on their conversations.
John brought several things which were really interesting. First off, there was the whole use of intrusive surveillance into people's homes. Up until then, we hadn't used it in this way, and the thought of using that evidentially rather than as an intelligence tool was a massive jump in policing. He had to go through a huge amount of internal, not criticism, but discussion about why you're doing this. What are the outcomes of you doing this? What are we throwing away by showing some of the tactics that we can use in public like this? But what John was absolutely focused on getting a result.
The task force need to secretly record conversations between the men to gather leads, or maybe even a confession.
We knew they would go to Constantinou's flat. That's where they would meet, and this made it a very, very juicy apple to pick when it came to choosing somewhere where to conduct technical surveillance.
The next stage is to think, well, if they're meeting there, are they talking about the murder? Are they discussing in private their thoughts? And so there was an incentive to try and develop that line of inquiry.
First, the team need access to the flat next door so they can install the latest surveillance technology.
We're going back to 1999. The technical advances then were years behind where they are now. So we needed the flat to enable us to conduct the technical surveillance on Constantinou's flat. And we got that, and we were able to do it.
The task force drill a hole through the wall from the next door flat and install a concealed microphone. At a nearby address, a team receive a feed from the mic and record every noise from Constantinou's flat 24/7.
So if somebody got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they would note movement. If anything was said, they would note that. So there was a log covering every minute of every day that recording was running.
The trouble is, no one in the gang is saying anything incriminating. Senior New Scotland Yard detective Kevin Davis asks his team to bring creative thoughts to the table.
We had to devise a system or a number of triggers to bring them together into the flat and then make them talk about the offence.
And one idea is quite brilliant.
Another method which we undertook was to serve on each of the suspects a written letter asking them to help us, and undertook that this was done personally and requested that they sign the officer's pocketbook to show that they'd actually received our letter. We did it to one of the suspects and not the other one. That then caused consternation with one of the suspects because he hadn't got a letter. It was a method of prodding, triggering, making them talk about the offence.
A local friend of the gang, 50-year-old Hussein Abdullah, spends time hanging around the flat. Abdullah is privy to the gang's secrets and unwittingly provokes some revealing conversations.
And there was a level of paranoia amongst the team. Hussein Abdullah, who had absolutely nothing to do with the offence, but became one of their party, almost enjoyed the excitement.
You know what that is, do you? Do you know what that is? That's murder.
Of course, by him talking about it constantly, made the others talk about it constantly.
As the police listen in, it becomes clear that they've made a major breakthrough.
Whilst they were feeling the pressure, they were still bragging about it. There was one line in particular that sticks out that really tipped the balance as to where we wanted to go next with this. We only had audio, but we knew who was saying it. And the line was along the lines of, and he burnt like a chicken. And you could hear the sound that somebody was mimicking a chicken as they were walking through that living room of Constantinu's house. So yeah, that was an absolute awful thing to hear.
Although horrendous to listen to and disturbing to listen to, from our perspective as investigators, this was exactly what we wanted. We wanted them to talk about the offence in such a way that it could only be them that had committed this awful crime.
Inspired by their success so far, Davis and DeHaan decide to expand the surveillance with a video camera.
There were two of us on the team who pushed to get a better product. We wanted it on video.
The team decide that video material of the gang members would be even more powerful as evidence in court.
I think the flat's bugged.
But the video surveillance equipment is quickly discovered by Constantinu.
We were monitoring this 24/7. I got a phone call. I made my way down to where the officers who were watching this and listening to this were. They told me, I knew when I got there from the phone call that there was no longer a video link.
The investigation is suddenly in crisis.
Then they played the video for me. I could clearly see a Phillips screwdriver aiming towards the camera just before it blacked out. He was also on the phone, alerting people and telling people that he thought the flat was bugged.
With the entire operation in jeopardy, it's time for the task force to act quickly or risk losing track of the gang.
The fear of these people getting away from us haven't been so close, so we had to effective arrest plans immediately.
Pereira and Constantinu are scooped up in a rapid operation before they have the chance to go to ground.
They were arrested and brought to Edmonton Police Station.
But the third member of the gang, 24-year-old Ozgay Shavat, is on the run.
One of the suspects had fled to Cyprus, northern Cyprus. And we don't have an extradition agreement with Cyprus.
But North Cyprus is a very, very small place. Not much escapes the authorities there, because if they want to find somebody, he's very, very quick to find. The police there, they know their community. They knew who he was long before we got involved.
With 2 out of the 3 suspects in custody, the investigation into the murder of Michael Menson has made enormous progress. But with the failure of the video surveillance, the investigation was more rushed than the Yard would have liked. Have they assembled enough evidence to convict the gang? And will the authorities in Northern Cyprus cooperate and deliver the final gang member to justice?
Back at Edmonton Police Station, Pereira and Constantinu are interviewed in separate rooms. Constantinu admits involvement but denies murder. But despite the police playing Pereira incriminating recordings from the surveillance tapes, Pereira maintains his innocence. With one confession and one denial, the task force turn their attention to the third member of the gang, who's hiding in northern Cyprus. A suspect who is not as safe from the reach of New Scotland Yard as he thinks he is. Ozgay Shavat, the third suspect, left for northern Cyprus soon after the murder of Michael Menson. For the task force to resolve the Menson case, Shavat needs to be brought to justice as well.
The police there, they know their community, they know their people. They knew who he was long before we got involved, so they didn't take long.
The Yard reach out to the police in northern Cyprus, and Shavat is arrested for the murder of Michael Menson on the 5th of August 1999.
The evidence for Shavat was the same evidence that we were presenting in London. Plus, he was interviewed by Detective Chief Inspector Ahmet Soylan from the Turkish police, and he admitted to him his involvement.
His trial is the first to begin in September in northern Cyprus.
I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how I was going to feel.
We suspended our lives and rearranged our lives because there's nothing more important at this time than to see this trial out and then see the next trial out.
While Cevat's trial proceeds, Pereira and Constantinu's case starts in November at the Old Bailey.
It's been a long time coming. Today, Michael Menson's brothers and sisters filed into the Old Bailey for the start of a lengthy trial.
The prosecution largely depends on the surveillance material gathered by the task force, and it is damning. In the surveillance recordings, Harry Constantinou is the most reflective of the gang.
I told them not to do it. He was walking along, he had his head down and dragging his feet. They approached him, I got out of the car and I goes to them, leave him alone, leave the geezer alone. Marek kept going on about he was black, let's burn him and all that. What could I do?
More details of the attack are revealed in the conversations between Constantinou and his friend, Hussein Abdullah.
He started saying, oh, let's do him and all that. Going all that. So they drove. Ozzy got out of the car and he tried to light his jacket, but it didn't work. So they went back to Mario's house, got some fuel, spirit or something, went back to him. You know what that is, do you? Do you know what that is? That's murder.
As the trials proceed in London and northern Cyprus, the tragedy of Michael Menson's last hours are laid out in exacting detail for the jury. It begins with Michael going to the hospital for treatment.
There's a W6 bus goes from there and there's a W9 bus goes from there. One goes to the hospital, one goes to Edmonton. He got the wrong one. He realised that the familiarity of his route to the hospital was out of sync, and then he got out in Silver Street. And hence that's why I say he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He just got on the wrong bus.
Earlier that day, Pereira's girlfriend told him that a black man had winked at her. That night, Pereira got his friends together and went out looking for a black man to beat up.
That's when their paths crossed. Unfortunately, time was not in favour of Michael Menson that day, and Pereira said, that's him, let's get him, or words to that effect. They got out and they beat him up.
Constantinou steals Menson's Walkman, and then a dangerous situation becomes deadly. Cevat and Pereira attempt to set Menson on fire.
And then when it doesn't work first time, they go, oh, let's have another go. Let's find some white spirit, let's have some accelerant and come back. And you're just going, why? Because he's black? Is that it? They didn't know Michael Menson. They'd never met him before. He'd never been in that area before.
This time they douse Michael in white spirit and set him ablaze.
By this time he'd moved further down the street. He was by the telephone box outside the park, and when he realised he was on fire, he leaned back into the telephone box to try and put it out. It didn't work, and then he ran quite some distance and would have been seen by the off-duty fireman and then the police officer, and the story went from there. It was so awful that so many things went wrong for Michael Menson that he had to have that happen to him.
By the time the gang have made their escape in a borrowed car, it is too late for Michael Menson. His deep burns, covering over 30% of his back, will lead to septicemia and his eventual death from a heart attack just over a fortnight later. On the 25th of November, Cevat is given 14 years for manslaughter.
Will you appeal? That's right.
And on the 21st of December, Pereira is sentenced to life. And Constantinou, like Cevat, gets a manslaughter sentence of 14 years.
Oh, it was absolutely terrifying and revolting. They must have known he was vulnerable. He was frightened and he was lost. And for someone with schizophrenia as well, the terror must have been off the scale.
This one sticks out as, you know, being one of the more brutal murders that I've dealt with. It's just awful. Absolutely awful. And what happened afterwards has been awful for the family too.
I wish I could wake up and it wasn't really the situation, and that Mike hadn't been killed, and that we didn't have to spend so much time after his death and so much of ourselves after his death, since his death, fighting and pushing.
For the family who fought a long battle to get justice for their brother, the verdict is some consolation.
Ultimately, it's justice for all of us. Because if we're going to live in a country where people are treated differentially because of their race, then we'll all be losing.
What Michael Menson started was a whole series of conversations about the police response to mental health, the police understanding of people telling the truth, people sometimes presenting things in strange ways, but actually if you investigate it properly, you can find out what it is they want to say. So I believe this led to massive changes. We had years of retraining all the officers. We've had a whole change in process, and since then we've had a lot of law change to try and protect people. So definitely this was the beginning of a change.
If you see it from a more historian's point of view, they were on the edge of things really changing, a huge change in policing. That they were policing for every community, not just one. Sometimes, because I've done a lot of crime, you see why people develop a motive through. You might then say, this is also stupid. Revenge is a stupid motive half the time. Michael Menson wasn't doing anything except being there.
The murder of Michael Menson is a truly unique case. An innocent, vulnerable man found himself in a deadly situation through no fault of his own. And it took the technology and strategies from counter-terrorism to bring his killers to justice. But it cannot be overlooked that it took a superhuman effort from his family to get the investigation back on track after a false start. This case not only changed policing, but changed New Scotland Yard for the better.